Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talks in Class. I'm Jenna. I'm so happy that you're joining me today for another episode. I am coming to you from the time capsule bedroom. I'm back in Wisconsin, so if you're watching on video, you can clearly see I'm actually sitting in my inflatable chair, which I've done this before and I always kind of regret it because it's not the most comfortable, but you know, in a pinch it works. I don't have a workspace here, so I'm sitting on the floor in an inflatable chair. I hope everybody's had a nice couple weeks since the last time we were chatting here on the pod. It's been a whirlwind over here. I flew home to Wisconsin last week. I had a nightmare travel day, which, you know, I feel like that's just kind of the way it goes now, but it was a very long day. And then this past weekend, I went to the class of 2004 high school reunion for my high school, but I did not graduate in 2004. I graduated in 2005. So I kind of crashed the reunion, but I was with a group of friends who did graduate in 2004, who I haven't seen in so long, probably close to, I don't know. I mean, they've graduated 20 years ago. It's probably been pretty close to 20 years since I've seen them. I came to town specifically to see them. That's why I planned these dates, because they were going to be in town for this reunion, and we had so much fun. I ended up meeting up with them, and then they were like, "Let's just come to the reunion." And I was, to be fair, I was friends with a lot of people in the class of 2004. I feel like I hung out with that class and the class below me more than my own class. Like I hung out with 2004 until they all graduated, and then when I was a senior, I hung out with the juniors. So whatever, it was fine, it was fun. It's a small town, I see half those people pretty often anyway. This weekend is our annual, I don't know, it's like a beer fest at an apple orchard. It is my favorite event of the year here in rural western Wisconsin. It's just so fun. I like being outside in the fall. They have all sorts of different beers from all sorts of different places, like a bunch of tents, there's music. It's always so fun. I always go with the same people. We just have a blast every year. So that's this weekend. And then I'm going back to LA, and by the time I get there, I am going to be exhausted, but well worth it. So as always, I will start with my what good happened. And you know what? My what good happened is honestly that I got to see these friends that I went to that reunion with. They are some of the people that I spent the most time with out of anybody in high school. Especially, there were two people specifically that I mean, they were my best friends in high school pretty much, especially from that class. And I haven't seen them in so long. It was crazy because it's like, I know that much time has passed, and I know there's this big gap in our lives where we haven't been keeping up with each other, and I don't really know everything about like their day-to-day lives, but it didn't feel like any time has passed. You know, I pulled up and we like instantly started laughing and like telling stories and putting on music, and we just had so much fun. And it's like, some things really don't change. And I think when you have friends like that, I'm just so grateful to have friends like that. Like I'll always be able to see these certain people and just jump right back into it, pick up right where we left off, and always have a blast. So it made my heart feel very full. I'm so happy that I got to see them, and you know, hopefully we don't wait another 20 years. So for this week's episode, we're continuing with the theme of the season, spooky season, and diving into something that I have mentioned in a lot of different podcast episodes, but I've never devoted an entire episode to in itself, and that is the massive popularity of witches in the 90s. I obviously talk a lot on the pod about fashion trends of the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, whatever, and also about how greater cultural events or world events impact fashion trends and how they cycle. And I find this also fascinating, how nothing happens in a vacuum. Everything impacts and is impacted by other things that are happening in the world at the same time. But that isn't only true for fashion trends. It applies to all sorts of trends, pop culture trends. And, you know, with hindsight, I think we can really see a lot more clearly a lot of these kind of weird pop culture trends that have happened throughout our lifetime, or these kind of really important or pervasive pop culture trends that have happened throughout our lifetime. And one of those trends that I always think about a lot during this time of year around Halloween is the just absurdly massive popularity of witches in the 90s. And as a child in the 90s, I didn't really think anything of this. You know, I didn't notice because when you're in it, right, you don't notice it because it's just normal, and that's why we often need some time to pass before we can really accurately identify these era-defining trends or era-defining bands or whatever. But now, when I think back on my childhood in the 90s, like, it was so saturated with witchy things in general, from every angle too. Like, I'm not just talking about witches in media, but obviously we had endless or seemingly endless TV and movies and whatever about witches, but there was also fashion trends. We had this sort of new agey, grungy style that now has been rebranded as whimsy goth or whimsical goth aesthetic, especially on TikTok. But, you know, as a product of the 90s, I think I would best describe it as melancholy and the infinite sadness aesthetic, or like Pier 1 in 1995 aesthetic. And speaking of Pier 1, this of course spread into home decor and just like everything. I mean, when I think of a Pier 1 store in the 90s, you could find a celestial pattern on literally anything that your little mind could dream up. I had glass drinking glasses, navy blue with like the sun, moon, stars in gold. I had picture frames. I had candles. I actually still have a really cool 90s celestial candle at my mom's. It's like round. It has a sun on one side and a moon on the other and then stars. I never burned it because obviously it was just like for decoration. And I even had that sun, moon, stars perfume. I think it was Karl Lagerfeld, but it was in this navy blue frosted glass bottle with the sun and the moon on it with the gold top. I remember thinking that bottle looked so cool. And I think my mom actually wore the perfume. It didn't particularly smell good from what I remember, but the bottle fit the aesthetic. And in the 90s, in culture as a whole, we had a really renewed interest in kind of new agey stuff, or I guess a continued interest in new agey stuff. And there were these stores that sold, I don't know, wind chimes and rain sticks, and crystals became like really popular. You know, we had the Pure Moods CD compilation that was full of chants and Enya and just nature sounds. And this was somehow popular. Like, this was part of popular culture. You could go to Target and remember the machine, you'd push the button and it would play a preview of the Pure Moods CD. And then at the same time, we had this, it's the 90s, right? Air quotes, it's the 90s, like independent women. It was like this third wave feminist attitude that really took hold and allowed pop culture to, I think, reclaim witches and witchcraft in the name of female empowerment. And we saw this everywhere through media, especially in the late 90s. And I was thinking about this, about witches, and kind of why I thought that they were so popular. And of course, it's really hard to pinpoint the exact origin of any trend, but you know, the witchy trend in the 90s is no exception. It's a chicken or the egg thing, right? Which came first, melancholy or the Natural Wonder store? The Pure Mood CD or, you know, Pure 1's Sun, Moon, Stars bedding collection? And the answer obviously is probably the same as any trend or pop culture phenomena, and that is that all of these factors influence each other. You know, the growing popularity of grunge styles and goth styles in fashion and the rise in bands that, you know, embrace these styles and kind of these themes influenced a growing interest in things like witchcraft and new age spirituality, and also vice versa, that a rise in individualism in culture, especially amongst young people, and this rejection of what was considered mainstream or normal, especially coming out of the 80s, really fueled a rise in pop culture and media that included characters that also in some way rejected what was mainstream or normal. You know, characters that were subversive somehow or different somehow, but still really cool, right? Because they had to appeal to an audience. And witches really check those boxes, I think. But if I personally had to pinpoint something that I think really allowed witchiness and witches to gain this massive popularity in the 90s, I really think it was feminism, particularly this kind of third wave feminist movement that took hold in the early 90s. And, you know, obviously as a kid, I didn't know about feminism or third wave feminism or any variety of feminism, but I did know about girl power, okay? And I knew about the Spice Girls because, make no mistake, the girl power of the Spice Girls was just the feminism that was happening in culture in the 90s packaged up to sell to young girls. I mean, girl.com, right? Like there were all of these sort of feminine empowerment things that were aimed particularly at young girls. And I think a lot of the witch-focused media from the 90s also was doing this, just in a slightly different way. And I won't go too much into this, but, you know, the third wave had a lot to do with power and kind of like power structures and systems of power. It wasn't just about women being able to go to work or women having equal rights, whatever that meant. It was about women gaining power or taking back their power, which is like very witchy. It was about, you know, challenging these existing power structures and also about women reclaiming various aspects of womanhood or femininity that were kind of downplayed in earlier like iterations of feminism. You could be very feminine and still be considered a feminist. So it was just very individualistic. This was like the sex positive, kind of rebellious, like riot girl thing, right? Think Bikini Kill and just this entire idea of individual female empowerment. Like whatever you were could fit within womanhood, even if you were a witch. And when you think about this, even on just a really surface level, it feels very parallel to a lot of ideas about witches. And I think what made them so popular, specifically in the 90s, this idea that witchcraft was a gift that's passed down through women, right? That's kind of the basis of it. The idea of it being a set of powers, literal powers that could do crazy and sometimes scary or dangerous things. And these are often derived through some sort of connection with nature or like some divine femininity. And the whole idea of witches being these unique women with this unique set of powers who other people are fearful of, that people have obviously been trying to control and even get rid of for centuries. And you guys know where I'm going with this. These cultural movements that happen outside of pop culture permeate everything. Music, fashion, pop culture. I mean, everything is impacting everything all at once. And I've talked about this before, but one thing that I notice so much when I rewatch TV, especially sitcoms from the 90s, is this mantra. It was used so much. They would say, it's the 90s. And this was just shorthand for saying like, it's modern times now. So whatever your outdated ideas of, you know, how people should live their lives are no longer apply because it's the 90s, you know, like you could do something totally ridiculous by, you know, 80s standards and justify it by saying it's the 90s. And this was very often used kind of for comedic effect and really often used to describe something done by a woman, like a woman living alone in the city instead of getting married. You know, this was crazy, but it's the 90s, or choosing a career over having a baby or, you know, whatever it was. And this general idea, even outside of the it's the 90s catchphrase, was incorporated into so many things back then. I mean, it really just makes sense that with the popularity of this cultural attitude, that witches then would enter the zeitgeist. And did they ever enter and kind of take over the zeitgeist? At the beginning of the decade, before, you know, the whole it's the 90s girl power really took hold, we had The Witches, which, have you guys watched this movie as an adult? I think it's from 1990. It is terrifying. The Witches, the way that they're portrayed is actually visually terrifying. And of course, this was a very traditional depiction of witches. They were scary, they were ugly, they were evil. The whole point was that the hero of the story had to deal with the witches and like get rid of them. They were not the heroes of the story. They were the villains. And then in 1993, we got Hocus Pocus, which
kind of followed the same rules when it came to portraying the witches. They were a little less ugly, but they were still bad. You know, the movie was about them, but it was also, and maybe even more so, about the kids who had to fight them and ultimately defeat them because they were evil. And I am sure I have talked about this before, but I was so obsessed with Hocus Pocus as a kid. I mean, obviously it's become this almost cult classic, especially amongst millennial women. And the Halloween vibes are just 10 out of 10. It's so good. It's so fun. But I was like deeply influenced by this movie. I don't know, maybe that I could probably pinpoint that as where my obsession with like witchy things began, was Hocus Pocus. But then in the mid-90s, the pop culture powers that be kind of realized that maybe there's something to this witches stuff, but maybe we could do it differently. Maybe we could portray them in a different way and actually put them in the center of the story, almost like a Wicked flip, right? Make them the hero of the story. And this is exactly the shift that happened, specifically in 1996. And to me, 1996 was like the year of 90s witches because it gave us Sabrina the Teenage Witch and The Craft, okay? To me, these are two of the most influential pieces of witch media, we can call them, of pieces of media that, in terms of bringing witches into massive mainstream popularity, like really did it for me and my little friends in the 90s. And the cool thing, or the interesting thing about Sabrina and The Craft, is that they were so different, you know, basically in every way. The tone was different, the characters were different, the story was very different, except for one really important aspect, which of course was that they were about teenage witches. And, you know, obviously that was the appeal of both of them to me and probably millions of other teenager tween girls all across the world. You know, obviously this wasn't the first time that we saw young witches portrayed. I mean, lest we forget such masterpieces of cinema as Teen Witch, starring none other than Robin Lively from, I think, 1989. So this wasn't new, but for me as a kid in the 90s, I mean, in 1996, I was 9. This was the first time that I really remember seeing teenage witches, but also witches that weren't like old, ugly, evil hags. And I was instantly obsessed. I mean, it took me and kept me. I was obsessed. The Craft, The Craft was obviously much darker, but ultimately, you know, the hero of the story was a witch, but there were also bad witches. Obviously, the other girls were very, very bad witches who were doing bad, evil things with their magic. It has some super creepy scenes. Like, some of those elements are just, still give me the chills. I actually just rewatched The Craft like 2 nights ago, so this is very fresh in my mind, but the scene at the end of the movie with Nancy and Sarah in the house and like the snakes and the rats and the bugs crawling out of the vents in the bathroom, it still gives me chills, even as much as it did when I was, probably more than it did when I watched it as a literal child in the 90s, which, by the way, I had zero business watching this, obviously, but there was something so captivating about this movie. You know, even as a kid, I was obviously too young to really understand a lot of what was going on. Like, a lot of those themes were very adult and very dark, but my friends and I just kind of latched onto the idea of magic and also of young people doing magic instead of it being, again, like an old, like, witchy woman in the woods. We were so obsessed. We tried to call the corners at recess. Like, imagine 4 little, you know, elementary school girls. How old are you when you're 9? Like 3rd grade, on the recess next to the swings, like calling the corners. And we had convinced ourselves one day, I remember, that one of our friends changed her eye color. This is just one of the things about being a kid, right? You play the Ouija board and you all convince yourself that nobody's moving it. Like, we convinced ourselves that this girl changed her eye color. What? But this is the impact that this movie had. We played light as a feather, stiff as a board at every sleepover. I'm sure it didn't do anything, but, you know, we tried. We were all in. And now that I think about it, I would love to know whose parents we successfully convinced to rent The Craft for us when we were like 10 years old. Whoever they are, thank you, honestly. And Sabrina the Teenage Witch, was also a big turning point for witches in the 90s because it was a really lighthearted depiction of witches. It was a sitcom, it was funny, you know, it was like Bewitched, which I also loved because I grew up watching Nick at Night. And honestly, Nick at Night was such a gift. I'm so glad that I grew up with access to those old shows. But anyway, I loved Bewitched, so when Sabrina came, I loved Sabrina too. And you know, nothing about witches or witchcraft was portrayed as evil really in Sabrina. It was more like inconvenient, you know, or just weird. It was like her quirk, but they weren't scary. They weren't bad. They were just different. And I don't know. I think anyone who was a kid watching Sabrina in the 90s would agree that difference, that quirk is what made them so cool. Like, I would have given anything to be a teenage witch with a talking cat and another dimension through my linen closet. I mean, I thought that was like the coolest thing that could ever happen to me. I dressed up as Sabrina for Halloween. I mean, it might have even been 1996. It was 1996 or 1997. And I basically just wore the coolest version of like a 90s teenage girl outfit that I could put together, even though I was like 10, so I didn't really own cool clothes. And then I just wore a witch's hat, and I think I had a little black stuffed cat, or maybe I had like a magic book. I had some sort of prop that was supposed to indicate that I was a witch, but I just remember people were so confused because I was essentially just wearing normal clothes. And actually, I think it might have been 1996, and this show premiered, by the way, in September of 1996. So when I was walking around dressed as Sabrina the Teenage Witch for Halloween in 1996, it had only been on TV for a month. So needless to say, people were very confused about this. But I did not care because I literally wanted to be Sabrina the Teenage Witch so badly that my little Halloween costume was the closest I was going to get. And fashion-wise, 1996 to 1997 was a big vibe shift, as I like to call them. It's like when fashion trends really shifted in a noticeable way. 1996 really felt like kind of the final moment of the true grunge 90s, the early 90s. Like the outfits that they wore in the craft feel perfect for 1995 or 1996, like really specifically. But by 97 or 98, fashion started to look a lot different. 1997 was this huge year for 70s comebacks in fashion, and color palettes changed a lot. Like the really colorful, kind of hippie, daisy printed and peace signs and stripes replaced a lot of those darker, grungier, like witchier color palettes, like lace and velvet and, you know, those dark greens and purples and stuff from the early 90s. But unlike today, because we have social media telling us instantly what's in or out, these transitions took several years, and some of these elements really hung on for, you know, years, certainly through the rest of the 90s. And Sabrina's bedroom is such a perfect, beautiful example of like 90s aesthetic with a little bit, I mean, I guess a lot of that kind of celestial, whimsical influence. But she had a lot of other typical 90s teenage elements. Like she had a lava lamp, but she had a big 3-piece stereo on top of her dresser, like, you know, we all wished we had. It was the bedroom of my dreams, and I still think about it. Like sometimes it just pops into my mind and I'm like, should I get a canopy over my bed because of Sabrina? If you don't remember, the walls were like a lavender purple color, and it had this amazing old stained glass window and this really pretty white sheer canopy over the bed, and the bed was this big ornate wood bed, and then she had this amazing like sun and moon just decorative thing hanging right in the middle of the canopy above the bed. It was so cool. And then it was just a very cozy room. It had a lot of like lights and lamps and pillows everywhere. I feel like there was something very cozy about that whimsical kind of celestial decor feeling in the 90s. And to be honest, I think about the celestial themes of the 90s like more than I care to admit. It's very deeply embedded into my brain. It's almost hard to properly convey, if you were not there, just how popular this celestial theme was, okay? People decorated whole rooms in this theme, and I don't mean that they put little tchotchkes around. I mean they literally painted the walls navy and like sponge painted stars on the walls. There was the wallpaper border that you could buy. And I do think that part of this popularity came from this really big rise in fascination with witches. But also, kind of like nature and also space in the 90s. Maybe it was just because I was a kid, but I just remember people like could not shut up about space and space exploration in the 90s. There was like the Hubble telescope and we landed on Mars, and then there was the Hale-Bopp comet. I think that's how you say it, Hale-Bopp. Do you guys remember this? This was a huge topic of conversation in my elementary school. I think Google says this was 1997 that the Hale-Bopp comet was visible. So I would have been in like 5th grade. And I just remember people going nuts over this comet. And, you know, at the same time, the 90s kind of commercialized and just nicely packaged up a lot of that new age spirituality kind of stuff in a really easily digestible way. And some of these new agey things that were really popular back in like the late 60s and the 70s, like astrology is a great example, came back in a huge way in the 90s, which, I mean, it makes sense given that the 60s and 70s had a massive resurgence around that time. But because it was the 90s, it was really easy to just get all of these weird things because you could just go buy it at the mall, at Natural Wonders. And this is so funny because one of my fellow nostalgia creators, Janine, her handle is Retro Avocado. If you guys don't follow her, you should. She does a lot of 90s content, but she just did a video about new age moms in the 90s going to Natural Wonders. And I was dying because why was this such a thing? Like, people went wild for these weird novelty mall stores like Natural Wonders. And, you know, thinking about it now, Natural Wonders was the epitome of like just commercialized new age. It was a mall store, probably next to the Disney store, where you could buy, I don't even know, rocks, rain sticks, Pure Mood CDs for sure, you know, wind chimes, probably books about like herbalism and like, I don't even know. I actually, speaking of herbalism, I remember going through a phase as a kid where I tried to convince my mom to dig up our rhubarb plants in the backyard and plant an herb garden there instead. And like, I was probably 10 years old. Literally what did I think I was going to do with a bunch of rosemary and sage? I don't know, but have I mentioned that I have always been very easily influenced? Because I guarantee this herb garden fixation was the direct result of some sort of like new age witchy thing that I saw at a store at Natural Wonders, or something in a TV show or movie. Honestly, probably the garden in Practical Magic with the fence around it. That's probably exactly where I got it. And my little brain latched onto it and I said, I need that in my backyard in Wisconsin. And when I think of the whimsy goth aesthetic, to use, you know, current TikTok vernacular, but in the actual 90s, this is sort of what comes to mind. It's a mixture of Natural Wonders and, you know, some leftover elements of the grunge styles of the early 90s. A lot of whimsical elements like florals and earth tones and jewel tones, celestial anything, you know, anything having to do with space or the cosmos, and just like a lot of velvet and mesh and lace and texture. But I think, speaking of this film, the crown jewel of that 90s like whimsy, witchy aesthetic was 1998's Practical Magic. I realize that 90s fashion is fully back. I mean, we're not even in like a resurgence anymore. It's just, that's what fashion is. So this shouldn't be that surprising, but every single outfit in Practical Magic looks like it could be on some young, cool TikTok fashion influencers, you know, fall fashion haul right now, today, which is unnerving because almost every single outfit in Practical Magic also looks like something that I literally wore in 6th grade or I wished I could wear because the cool older girls were wearing it. It's very, very unnerving. So many floral patterns, so much velvet, so much velvet. And I mean, really, it's so good. And looking at it now, the movie is visually so well done. It captured these characters so well. It just captures the vibes so well. And, you know, a lot of the things that they wear in the movie were just in style at the time. I was wearing them in 6th grade, you know, in rural Wisconsin, but the way that they're put together, combined with obviously the setting, the house, the town, everything, it just creates this really specific feeling that so perfectly communicates the characters, but also the fact that they're witches and just like the whole feeling of the movie. And their outfits are just a really good mix of various things that were trendy, but also are very witchy, like all the earth tones and the dark colors with all the florals and the, you know, very back to nature witchy. It's like they took all of the witchy elements of fashion and put them on these characters. And practical magic, theme-wise, culturally-wise, hits all of those 90s witchy themes. It's the idea of women being shamed and outcast for their uniqueness. In this case, obviously, it's because they're witches, and they come from a long line of witches that have always been ostracized in their little town. The idea of rejecting that thing that makes you different and trying to fit into the norm, but then, of course, ultimately realizing that you can't do that and you shouldn't do that because it's what gives you your power. That's Sandra Bullock's character's like whole arc. The idea of powerful women, you know, overcoming evils. In this case, it's a man, which a little on the nose, but whatever. And the idea of sisterhood. Clearly, that's like a huge theme in witchy media, this unbreakable bond of sisterhood. You know, that is kind of the core, I think, of a lot of witchy media from the 90s. And of course, it makes sense in the context of witches because they're all women and the coven is important and the lineage of their powers is really important. And again, you know, it was the 90s, girl power, girl power all the way. And what's more girl powery than a coven of witch sisters with actual magic powers? And practical magic came right after the Spice Girls blew up, so the girl power thing was like everywhere at this time. It was released in late 1998, which was less than a year after Spice World hit theaters in the US. So this theme of girl power was like very pervasive in pop culture. It had conquered. It was in the, you know, natural conversation of girls and women everywhere. And practical magic at its core is a movie about sisterhood. It's about women. And to say that in a cuter way, it's about girl power, just like a lot of the witchy things were. And we can't really talk about witches and sisterhood specifically without talking about Charmed, the TV show, which also premiered in 1998. 1998 was another good year for witches, apparently. I probably still have several VHS tapes with this lineup on them, but I distinctly remember that Charmed came on right after Dawson's Creek on the WB Wednesday night. And, you know, how is it that I'm so old that saying the WB feels ancient? Do you guys remember the WB and the big dancing WB frog? Those were the days. I loved the WB. And now that it's like 25 years old, they play reruns of Charmed all the time on, I don't know, like TNT or something, but it's always on when I go to the gym. And, you know, it's not great. Not that I would expect a Y2K era WB drama series to be great, but the aesthetic is great. And that is something that the WB always did very, very well. They may not have always nailed story or dialogue or, you know, even acting sometimes, but the outfits, set design, check, check. And Charmed fashion was so good because the characters had their own personalities, obviously, that like showed through in the clothes, but the outfits were exaggerated. I mean, they were not realistic outfits. They were exaggerated versions of popular fashion at the time, which was common in TV shows, especially that type of TV shows. But, you know, no adult that I had ever seen would ever wear most of the stuff that they wore on the show. There's a lot of leather pants and crop tops and halters. It was kind of Coyote Ugly influence from my memory, but just like a lot of over-the-top outfits. There was a rerun happening at the gym the other day, and one of them was wearing this like really aggressive halter top that kind of looked like the top of Marilyn Monroe's, you know, classic white dress, but it was literally cropped like under her boobs. And then she had the lowest pants I've ever seen, and she was just like out for a cocktail. Like, who would wear that? It was very stylized, but that's what made it so fun for me, especially watching when I was a kid. You know, you kind of still had this delusion that when you grew up, you were going to also dress like that. So it was wishful thinking. But, you know, the show was ultimately a girl power show like so many others. It was about three sister witches who basically have to fight off some evil demon or warlock or whatever in every single episode. It was like Buffy style ass-kicking girl power, which, by the way, Buffy is another great example of both 90s witchy, like feminism and amazing 90s witchy style, especially Willow, obviously, Buffy's witch friend, who, I mean, she had a very impressive collection of patterned tops and like long skirts and such. Very 90s. And it really took me into adulthood, like fully into adulthood, to look back and realize just how deep of an impact witchcraft and the idea of witches had on not just me, but really pop culture as a whole in the 90s. You know, you kind of have this tendency when you think back on things to think that must have just been me. Like, I was just really interested in witches. But no, like the Miranda Priestley Devil Wears Prada speech, it wasn't just like a unique interest of mine. It was like, you know, sold to me through pop culture. And there are endless examples of super popular witches in media, witchy imagery in pop culture, music, fashion, you name it. I mean, I can't talk about all of them as much as I would like to. And that is going to make the list for today's episode very difficult, but I have to try. So I'm going to leave you with my top 5 media portrayals of witches. And this is not strictly from the 90s. This is just in general. Number 5, The Witches of Eastwick from 1987. The Witches of Eastwick are hot, single friends who are all bored with the men in their town. Like, okay, relatable. But also it was Cher, okay? Cher, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Susan Sarandon with the most incredible late 80s perms you've ever seen. It's a weird movie if you've never seen it, but ultimately the witches discover their powers and they just voodoo doll the hell out of the evil man. So, you know, girl power. Number 4 is Practical Magic from 1998. And, you know, listen, I do mostly love the portrayal of witches in Practical Magic for the aesthetic value. I can't lie about that because, I mean, when can I move into that house? We all want to live in that house with the herb garden in the backyard. But I also love the family aspects of the movie, the sisterhood, the importance of the coven and the lineage and how, you know, ultimately the coven and the family is like what gets them through. And I also feel like I should note that if you haven't read the book or the prequel book, The Rules of Magic, I do highly recommend those. They're great fall reading. Number 3 is Hocus Pocus from 1993. I just love Hocus Pocus. I mean, what can I say? I'm a basic girl at heart. I love Hocus Pocus. I'm a child of the 90s. And this is the most, I don't know, non-girl powery portrayal of witches on my personal list because the witches in the movie are 100% the villains. They are bad and they really don't have any redeeming qualities, but they are so fun. The portrayal of witches in this movie is fun. The movie is fun. They have really distinct personalities. The costuming and makeup is just so good. It's so iconic, so recognizable. And even though they're bad, you can't help but love them. And that, I think, is what makes them such iconic witches in pop culture. Number 2, The Craft from 1996. Listen, I was 9 in 1996 when this movie came out, so aesthetically, the 4 witches in The Craft were everything that I kind of wished I could be, but I was a little too young to try to pull that off. Probably except Nancy. I don't think I was like quite that extreme, but the others had such great 90s style that had just enough witchiness to it to like fit the movie, but was still just very trendy and cool. And I mean, yeah, they're immature and they're petty and they use their magic to do harm, a lot of it. But it was kind of awesome, you know, as a young girl to watch 4 teenage girls harness the power of the universe and use it to wreak havoc on the kids that tormented them at school. I mean, maybe they should have drawn the line at literal murder, but, you know, other than that, girl power. And number 1, my favorite media portrayal of witches, and honestly probably just one of my favorite, if not my favorite pieces of witchy media, American Horror Story Coven from 2013. And I could do an entire podcast on this season of American Horror Story. In fact, I could probably do an entire podcast just on Madison Montgomery's fashion, Emma Roberts' character's fashion, because when I tell you, it lives rent-free in my mind to this day. It was like my entire like aspiration at that time. That was kind of my aesthetic, but I wasn't that cool and I just went wild over it. So many Jeffrey Campbell Lita boots, so many floppy hats, so many like tiny mini dresses. I had a lot of those things, but I had the fake Charlotte Russe version, so, you know, she was aspirational. I've only actually finished 2 seasons of American Horror Story ever. I've tried to watch many seasons, but Coven and the first season are the only ones that I've actually ever finished, and I've watched Coven so many times over. And aesthetically, I mean, to me, it's perfect. It's so amazing. The 2013 of it all, I mean, just everything. Now watching it, it's like, wow, it's so 2013, but also just New Orleans, which is one of my favorite cities, but also just a perfect backdrop for this show. And I love the portrayal of the witches. I love the portrayal of the Coven. I love that they all have their unique powers. I love the idea of the Witches' Council and how they handle like witch on witch crime. I love the idea of the Supreme and the Seven Wonders. And Stevie Nicks is part of their Coven. I mean, that's the Coven that I want to belong to. So far this year, I have rewatched The Craft and Practical Magic from this list. I did do a full Coven rewatch last year, so I don't know if I'm going to do it again, but you know, I just might. I just might. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. If you did enjoy it, I always appreciate it if you can share it or just share the pod in general. It's a huge help. Or if you could leave a review or even just a rating, that's always a big help for the podcast. I will be back on the next one, so I will see you all then. Bye.